Great. Okay. So now we
Speak,
are.
speaker view 2.
Yeah. Okay. Now we are recording. So as I started to say, we're looking at Deuteronomy chapter 1, chapter 21 rather, and we're not going to go all the way back. Chapter 21, and we're going to begin around verse 20. And if you have the Eitz Chaim Humash, we are on page 1114. 1114, verse 20, chapter 21. So last time, as I said, we looked in depth at the law of Ben Sorer and Moreh, the stubborn, rebellious child. We looked at what the Talmud had to say about it and how the rabbis limited it more or less out of existence. And the rabbinic, in the Talmud, the majority opinion held by several rabbis, lo hayav v'lo yiyeh, that this law never was applied, never will be applied. The idea that parents would lead their child to execution was simply abhorrent. Reading it back into the biblical verse. And then, of course, they ask the obvious question. If the law wasn't meant to be applied, why is it even in the Torah? Right? And they say that the reason it's in the Torah is to expound upon it and receive reward, which is itself interesting. In other words, it's there to be studied. There is a value in study even when things are not applicable. And you see this most clearly in sections of the Talmud, for example, which go into great detail about how sacrifices are to be offered. And long discussions about sacrifices and which sacrifice when and what the priest is supposed to do. But by the time the Talmud is compiled, sacrifices have been over for hundreds of years. And yet, the idea is expound and receive reward. And that continues on when Maimonides writes his famous law code, whole sections having to do with that. Another example, laws of purity and impurity, which were practiced in rabbinic times to some extent, but largely had fallen by the wayside. And yet, again, expound and receive reward. There is one dissenting opinion. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yonatan. He says, no, this law was applied, and I sat on the grave of the person who was executed. It seems very odd. He also says the same thing. You might remember we looked at the city which has gone over to idolatry, and that city and its inhabitants are to be utterly destroyed. Again, the rabbis say there never was and never will be such a city. Even a city that has one mezuzah is not to be destroyed, right? Rabbi Yonatan says there was such a city, and I sat on its ruins. I think he is troubled by the idea that this is in the Torah and inapplicable. And what he's saying, I sat on its ruins, is just hyperbole. Clearly, he didn't sit on the ruins of the city and also sit on the ruin of the grave of the stubborn and rebellious child. Now, the real theological challenge here is not in the rabbinic mind that this law would be applied, but actually it's a philosophical idea, which is very troubling. And that idea is that this is a preemptive intervention because of what this child will ultimately be led to do. That this child will become a thief, this child will become a murderer, and as a result, better to kill him now before he commits these crimes. And the rabbis really have two ideas here. One is to protect the people who will eventually, be murdered and have things stolen. But the other is also this odd theological idea that it is better for them, the person themselves, to die before doing such things, because as a result of doing these things, they're in the next world, they will suffer. And so, in a sense, they'll be better off. Now, that's a very odd idea. And the Talmud goes on to discuss cases like this. You might have seen a movie called Minority Report. I don't know if anybody saw that. I think it was with Tom Cruise, and it's about pre-crime. They have this mechanism, this very strange mechanism in the future for predicting with accuracy that someone will commit a crime. They learn about it in advance. That person is then locked up so that they can never commit this crime. And in the story, in Minority Reports, there's an error. And the main character is now, locked away, presumably forever, and was not going to commit the crime. But this idea, preemptively punishing someone or limiting them because of what they want to do, is analyzed by the Talmud. There is one clear case that I think most people would agree upon, and that's the case of the rodef, the pursuer. Someone who is pursuing you to murder you can be killed. The Torah is explicit about that, and even others who come to rescue that person can kill the person who has not yet, but is about to murder. Now, that case seems much more clear than our case, because here with the stubborn and rebellious child, we're speculating as to what the future consequence will be. There it seems very clear. And the Talmud analyzes the case of the pursuer, and what if he could, for example, what if he could be stopped by wounding him, keeping him from doing it without having to take his life, and a whole host of other things. Nonetheless, I have to say that this analysis, I think, is quite troubling. And I don't know that there's a way to get beyond that. So this is sort of my take, and what I think the Talmud has to say about the stubborn and rebellious child. I'm gonna open it up just for a minute. If people have comments. Sandy, go ahead.
Right. So I mean, I can't think of the words to say. It's really, really terrible. I mean, first of all, what type of God would even think of such a law? It's a God of fear. And second of all, to kill somebody before they actually do something terrible. I mean, don't we have free will? Where did the idea of free will? To me, it seems like this is preordained, no free will, and no chance for repentance, because when someone dies, of course, they can't repent, but they can repent in this life. So I just see it just seems so bad.
So again, two things about that. One is that the rabbis, want to do away with this entirely, and they do effectively, simply saying, because of all the limitations, it never was. There is I've been studying this with a colleague, a rabbi who lives out in Seattle, Washington. We've been studying Talmud together for a couple of years, which has been one of the great joys of my life. And one of the things, because there's this talk about being a drunkard, one of these things you know, and we were talking about it, not so much in terms of being a drunkard, it's a drug addict, right? Someone who is really, I think there's an idea here that free will may in fact be limited. That there are people who are so far, you know, you think about junkies and you think about what they will do to get a fix, and they will rob and steal and a host of other things, right? So and really, you know, in some sense, you might argue they don't have free will anymore. They really are in a circumstance where they can't help themselves. Now, we need to hold them accountable anyway for what they do. But I would like to see this as an instance of that. A person who simply can't help themselves. Any other comments or questions?
Can I just add?
I know you're.
Can I just
I
ask you? But wait, does anyone else? I'll see if anyone.
don't know. Does anyone else have anything? Okay, go ahead.
Well, I mean, society helps such people. I mean, it's not like, you know, they're going to go out and do these terrible things without. I mean, that's what these programs are, to help people that are.
Yeah. But the question of how many programs are there and how effective are they, and how much access does an individual actually have to them, and how much does a person even willing to admit that they have a problem? All those things I think are relevant. I would argue that there are certainly cases where junkies, addicts are so far gone that they really can't exercise judgment. But that's a question for another day.
So should they be? So should they be killed? Is that
No.
so? The Torah says then kill them.
In our society, we don't advocate that. I don't think the Torah is advocating that. But this idea, you raised the question of free choice, right? And I'm really only responding to that.
I see.
Yeah, I'm not responding in the sense that therefore someone should be executed. Certainly not.
You're saying they don't have free will.
At a certain point, someone like that, it's not really easy, if at all possible, there to make such a choice. Again, we don't excuse it. We need to prevent it any way we can, and yes, and have the programs that are there and do what we can to get them into them. Okay, we're going to move on to the next law, which you'll see it's beginning with verse 22. So, if a man is guilty of a capital offense and is put to death, and you impale him on a stake, you must not let his corpse remain on the stake overnight. You must bury him the same day. An impaled body is an affront to God. You shall not defile the land that God has given you. So, this, first of all, I want to make it clear that this person is not executed by impaling, right? That's not one of the executions that Jewish law permits. This is, should you choose, after you execute this person, to impale them, there's a limitation on what you can do, and that limitation is the body can only hang until dark, and then they must be taken down and they must be buried. Impalement was fairly common in ancient times. I don't know if you ever saw the Game of Thrones, which, yeah, it was rather gruesome. But one of the things in this admittedly fictional narrative was to see people whose bodies were displayed, enemies whose bodies were displayed like this. And it really operates on two levels. And the Romans did this, and the Greeks did it, and the Egyptians notably did it. And it was a way of disgracing your enemy. It was a way of sort of a public advertisement as to what should be done, right? You know, in this country, we used to hang people with public executions, which is just abhorrent and gruesome. And of course, you think about lynchings, for example, where people's only crime was the color of their skin. And those executions, became entertainment. There were even the equivalent of postcards that were made with pictures of the executions, and that seems horrible. It is horrible. That whole idea is horrible. But there is another side to it, and that's the proof that this other side is not valid, by the way. But there are people who would claim it's a deterrent. People who see this happening would not commit the same crime. I don't buy it. I think people, there is just as people are attracted to the scenes of fire and accidents, and I think this is similar. Now, this idea. Now, you could argue, by the way, the Torah could, if this is abhorrent and an offense to God, why allow it at all? Right? It simply should say, you may not impale him, period. Here too, as in many places, I think the Torah is gradual rather than revolutionary. And the Torah seeks to contain and eventually to eliminate certain behaviors, and therefore permits things. And the example, and we've talked about this many times in the past, those who've been with me, the best example is slavery, which ultimately becomes outlawed, but the Torah tries to make it more humane, and eventually the Jewish community leaves it altogether. So a couple of laws come out of this brief passage. One, which you may be familiar with, is the idea that anyone who dies should be buried within 24 hours, which was a very common idea up until recent times. It really pushed to have the funeral the same day. If you could possibly do it, certainly the next day, you would not wait several days before you buried someone. That has largely changed. And it's changed for a couple of reasons, and changed in Jewish law for a couple of reasons. One has to do with the survivors being able to be present at the funeral. Now, Jewish communities, didn't used to look the way they do today. And in fact, we routinely, I think about my kids who live in Texas. We have family members, brothers, sisters, children, who are not around. And the idea of having a funeral without them is something which doesn't seem to be right. And in fact, according to Jewish law, it is one reason why you are permitted to wait. Now, I have to take note of the fact that in Israel, they don't take that position. In Israel, they bury the same day because, the most right-wing Orthodox rabbis are essentially in charge of this whole process in Israel. And it can be really horrific. They also don't allow women to come to the grave. And they're, it's just horrible. You can imagine a person's wife not being able. And in general in Israel, that's where the funeral takes place. It's not like here where you would go to a funeral home and then not everybody, some people would go on to the grave. That's it, right? And that is, I think, a reading of this law, which, as it's derived from this passage, which not only are there many, many more liberal halachic traditions and have been for a long time. But, just seems very inhumane. I want to say one more thing and then I'll take a question. And now I've lost, give me a second. Oh, yes. Another reason why I think, and I personally believe, that it's okay to delay a funeral, though not indefinitely, is because the way we are able to treat the deceased, the body, is now different. We have refrigeration. This idea, now remember that Judaism does not permit embalming. And for reasons, if you want, I can go into, but the idea that a person will begin, and you'll forgive me, but that's the subject, right? That their flesh will begin to deteriorate with the odors involved and everything else, but it simply is no longer a concern. The body can be preserved. And this idea, like essentially the idea of leaving someone out and watching their body disintegrate as they were impaled, this is no longer a concern. And so it seems to me, you wouldn't want to wait for weeks, but a few days. I don't think there's any violation of Jewish law for that. Last thing I'll say about it. One of the things that Jewish law does derive from this, which does have some modern applications also, is that the primary source of impurity, this is ritual impurity, is a dead body. And that a person who has contact with a dead body becomes ritually impure. And that's why, for example, a Kohen, right, a priest, does not generally go to a funeral, to a grave, to a burial, and if they do, will stand on the road. Right? So, because the idea of a priest becoming ritually impure, if the temple was rebuilt tomorrow, if the Messiah came and the temple was rebuilt, that priest would be ineligible to go and serve. Right? So this idea, and I actually think that there's an interest, I think there may be an interesting reason behind that. And that has to do with the difference between this people, Israel, and Egypt, which they left behind. Because Egypt primarily was about death, right? And these pyramids that were built and all of that was about, the afterlife and what would happen there. There's stories of pharaohs who were buried with their slaves so that in the next life, they would have people to attend them, right? Okay, so much for this passage. I'm going to open up for your questions again.
I think you kind of answered it right after I put my hand up. But even though we have refrigeration and everything, isn't there some kind of limit to the length of keeping a body as opposed to Christianity?
Yeah, well, that's true. And I'm often amazed as I talk to Christian colleagues by the fact that a funeral could take place a week or 10 days later, and often does. Another difference, of course, is we insist on burial and we mourn afterwards, right? We have Shiva, for example. But if you look, for example, at Catholics, and I think other Christians as well, they do their mourning before they have a wake. People come, the body is there, and that can go on for several days. One of the reasons why they embalm is because the body is not going to be buried, right? In fact, it's going to be out for, quote, viewing. And the idea that people will come and view, well, the corpse has to be not all, cosmetics, all kinds of things, which from the Jewish point of view is not prizing the dignity of the deceased. And based really in this passage here, burial should be done as quickly as is, I would say, as reasonably possible. Okay, any other questions? Sandy, go ahead.
I forgot to ask you before with the rebellious child, so can I ask you that now? So, if God makes a law that I guess you could say God doesn't expect to ever
Yes.
be carried out, and I know you gave a reason, other reasons for other laws, which I think it's a different category because they're not about killing somebody. But anyway, do you think that there's a problem in a certain say case where a couple doesn't like their child's doing bad things, and the law gives them, quote, permission to kill their child? Do you see a problem there?
I don't see a problem in the sense that they couldn't. The Torah itself requires some sort of judicial proceeding. They can't, if they kill their child, they're murdering their child. That, even from the point of view of the Torah, that they have to bring them to the child has to be punished in other ways. They have to be warned. The judges have to decide, in fact, how reasonable this is. All of that is not rabbinic. That's in the Torah itself, right? So no, I don't think so. I don't think a parent could take it upon themselves. We do see parents, however, today, and I come back to the idea of addiction, who ultimately come to the conclusion that they have to cut themselves off from their child. And there we're really talking about an adult, right? But it's just, they can't. They've come to the limits of what they can do, and they're themselves suffering. I mean, that's an extraordinarily painful thing to do. I have to say, I know parents who have done it. I've counseled parents who have done it. And I didn't counsel them not to do it, because ultimately, I can't get into this suffering that they're experiencing. Okay, anything else on the right now on what we've looked at? If not, I want to move on and go to the next. Yes.
I have one more before. Is it just a superstition that pregnant women shouldn't come to a cemetery?
The answer is yes. It is a superstition. This idea, well, there are two ideas, neither one of which is valid. One is, God forbid she should fall into the grave. But that's just ridiculous, because she just doesn't have to stand at the edge of the grave, right? The other is a superstitious notion that somehow the spirit of the dead, jealous of this life, will do something to injure the fetus. And that's pure superstition. So yes, pregnant women absolutely can go to the cemetery. And to prevent them from doing that, well, anyway. So yes, it's a superstition. It's not Jewish law. Not at all. Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay, so we come now to a series of laws which discuss our obligations to protect the property of others. We're at chapter 22, verse 1. If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, and by fellow, I think it's clear in the Torah, this is achicha, your brother. And this clearly doesn't mean your, your parents' other child, right? But it does refer, I think, to your fellow Israelite. The obligation to non-Jews, at least as the rabbis understand it, is more limited, and in some ways is meant to reflect the way they treat people, that they don't have such laws. And you can argue against that, Okay, so your fellow's ox or sheep has gone astray. Do not ignore it. Take it back to your fellow. All right, so you can't, if you see this animal wandering around, you can't either say, not my problem, right? Or, yeah, but he doesn't even live around here, right? I have to, according to the Torah, you simply have to return it. And if your brother does not live near you, or you don't know who he is, you should take it home and it will remain with you until your brother claims it, right? So this is even a greater obligation. If they don't live near you, right? So you can't give it to them. And maybe you don't even know who they are. You have to take it into your house. Now, I should point out, what does into your house mean? In general, in those days, people who had houses had, and who were farmers and herders of animals, generally lived on the second floor of the house, and the bottom floor was like a barn. Right? So the idea of taking it into your house, as it's literally, though of course more generally it means take possession of it. And what does that mean? It means you also have to feed it, and you have to care for it, right? Until your fellow comes and claims it. Now, there are limitations on this, and that is, well, first of all, how will this person know? And the answer is, you have an obligation to publicize that this animal has been found. Please come and get it. The other thing is that there has to be something distinguishing about the animal. And we're going to see in a minute also items that you've found. In other words, the person who comes to claim it has to be able to identify. You can't have someone who simply sees the announcement and goes and picks it up, right? Because anyone could do that, right? And so, this actually could be a way of acquiring something that doesn't belong to you. So what happens if you find this sheep wandering around? You don't know who owns it, and you can't find out. And if you were to find out, I'm sorry, if someone were to come and they can't identify it, then you don't give it to them. Which leads then to the idea that you have to do some diligence to find it, but ultimately the animal or the object comes to belong to you. And the way the Jewish tradition analyzes, the way the rabbis analyze it, is this: the person who loses the item that doesn't have any distinguishing markings essentially knows that they won't be able to recover. There won't be any way, because they won't be able to identify it. And that leads to a legal category called yeush, which means the person assumes it's no longer theirs. And therefore, when it's found, it's ownerless, because in some sense, the owner has given up all claims because they can't identify it. And therefore, this item, which is called a mitzia, which, if you think about it today, how do people use the word mitzia? It's some bargain that they found in the market, but it's literally a mitzia is something that is found, right? So they find something, it can't be identified, they get to keep it. So to give you an example, which is more common to our day rather than wandering animals, you find $20 in the street. Okay, there's nothing on the bill. There's no way of marking it. If you publicize, I found $20, how will a person say that $20 is yours? You're entitled to keep it. However, If you find the $20 and it's in a wallet, and there's anything in the wallet that could lead you back to the person, you have an obligation to try to find the person. The money is not yours, and so on. Right? So if there are, now you might argue, well, then shouldn't you just be obligated to give it to tzedakah, right? Why are you entitled to it? And the answer is, people have the obligation to give money to tzedakah, but not necessarily this money, not necessarily this amount. The two are independent. Should you want to give it to tzedakah, say, I didn't work for this, this didn't belong to me, harei ze mishubach, even better. But there is no halachic, legal requirement to give it to tzedakah. So you have to decide. Okay, so this, we're going to go on just a little bit more. You should bring it home. It remains with you until your fellow claims it, and then you give it back to him, and do the same with his ass, with his garment. So too you will do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. One more thing, in terms of the animal, you take the animal in, you have to feed it, you have to take care of it. And when it is claimed, the owner has to pay you for having harbored the animal, and for the expense that you have undergone, and so on. Can you milk the cow or shear the sheep? Yes. And that then, those costs, the value of that would count against your expenditures. Okay. So the next one, well, let me stop there because the next one is a little bit different. So let me change the view and go to gallery. And questions about this, about lost objects, about animals that are going astray, about the obligations we have to them, about our ability to keep them, they can't be identified, anything at all. Hearing none, we'll go on to the next verse. Okay, so one more thing about an animal. If you see your fellow's ass or ox fallen on the road, don't ignore it. You must help him raise it. This law also you can find in the book of Exodus. There really, I think, as people analyze this, there are really two things going on. One is to benefit the animal, right? That this animal that is straining under a load or is falling over is suffering. And you have to intercede in order to help the animal. But there's also the idea that you owe it to your fellow to help preserve their wealth. This law also occurs in Exodus 23:5, where in some ways it has an even stronger, I'm just going to read it to you. It has an even stronger statement where it says, when you see your enemy's ox or ass wandering, you must take it back to him. When you see the ass of your enemy under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it. So here it says achicha, your brother, and there it says your enemy. So how do we account for the difference? In some sense, here it's broader, because even your enemy is your brother. Right? There's and in Exodus, it's somewhat the same thing, but there it's kind of how much more so. If you have to do this for your enemy, how much more so do you have to do it for someone who's not your enemy? I think taking the two together really makes it quite emphatic. So the idea here is protect the property of your fellow Israelite and be kind to the animal. And we're going to see another law that also in some ways deals with kindness to animals. The next one, however, is very, in contemporary terms, not something that we would think is a problem. I think many people would not think. A woman must not put on men's apparel, nor shall a man wear a woman's clothing. Whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. So we're talking about cross-dressing, right? And being in drag, right? All those kinds of things, which are really considered acceptable in our society by many people. Before I even talk about the broader idea here, I want to emphasize that this is culturally determined. In other words, in one culture, women's clothing and men's clothing are defined differently than in another. And for example, when people started wearing blue jeans, which were called Western wear at the time, I know this because my grandfather was a pattern cutter and a designer, and who held one of the first patents on jeans as they developed. They were men's clothing. Women were not wearing them. But as we all know today, lots of women wear jeans. You can go to a store and you'll find that there are more women's jeans than men's jeans, right? I mean, to say that this is men's clothing is simply not accurate. And I'll go the other way too. In Scotland, if a man wears a skirt, no one would claim that he's cross-dressing, right? So what is men's clothing and what is women's clothing is completely culturally determined, and as cultures change, the definition changes. Now, I've said that. However, in some, Haredi, right-wing, extreme Orthodox communities, you still have this notion women shouldn't wear pants, period, right? It's wrong for women to wear pants. There was, I even synagogues I've been in my lifetime, women would wear pants, but you wouldn't wear them to shul, right? Women certainly wouldn't go on the bima wearing pants, and this is tied to notions of modesty, that pants are sort of more revealing of the female figure. So I think that's changed in the Jewish community largely. But in Haredi communities, it still exists. Women are expected to wear long skirts. We think of the best analogy I could come up with is sort of Amish dress, a certain way of dressing. I will tell you that my wife's aunt, who is Haredi, lives in Sfat in Israel, we went to visit them. She has, I think, 13 children, maybe 12, 13 children. Anyway, when we went to visit them, she didn't have that many. And she had a young son. And when we got there and he saw Beth wearing pants, he just didn't know what to make of it. He was truly perplexed. Okay, so it's all culturally determined. Why should the Torah have such a law? I think the idea, there are a couple of ideas. One is that this could lead to a person who is misled from the Torah's point of view and thinks that a woman is really a man and gets involved with the relationship and ultimately could lead to sexual contact and the man being betrayed, in some sense, or tricked into doing something that the man who sees the cross-dressing wouldn't want to do. So I think that's one element. Another element, though, is, and we'll see this in other laws pretty soon, and that is that the Bible really believes, Torah really believes in separations. There are men, there are women, men and women, both created in God's image, but shouldn't be mixed in a certain sense. It should be clear who are the men, who are the women. Of course, that's being really challenged today by notions of gender fluidity. People who don't want to define themselves as either male or female, which the Torah certainly and clearly would reject. If you're interested in more on this subject, by the way, I would recommend that you check out my podcast. My podcast partner and I, and he's a priest, an Episcopal priest, have a long discussion about gender fluidity, which I talk from the Jewish tradition. He talks from a liberal Christian tradition. He's a person who identifies himself as gender queer. I think if you have the time to listen to it, it's a really interesting conversation. So I recommend it to you. And just want to think if there's anything else to be said about this. I don't think so. Let me open it one final time for any questions or comments about anything that we've seen today. Okay, well, I'm going to stop here, I think. I can do the next section in the time we have left. So I'm going to do that. And this has to do, if on the road you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledglings or the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young. Let the mother go. Take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. Right? So this idea that you have to chase away the fledglings, the mother bird who's sitting on the nest or hovering nearby, and just take the eggs, there are two kinds of explanations which are given in tradition for this. The first one goes back to that ass that has to be helped, right? Which is about not being cruel to animals. Right? The idea of in the face of the mother, taking away the chicks or even the eggs will upset the mother. And so we're not even talking now about physical pain. We're talking about psychological pain. Right? And the idea here is that animals, not only can feel pain, but in some sense, we should understand that they have feelings. And now, do all animals have feelings? Unclear. We know that elephants do, right? Elephants really mourn. There's lots and lots of elephants. Do chickens, hens? I don't know. But that's one explanation. The other explanation, I think, is interesting, and that is, even if they feel it, you will feel it. That this teaches you, doing this, to become callous. That you will, understand that the bird might have feelings. It sort of inures you to being a cruel person, right? It in some sense becomes a stain on who you are. And I want to say this leads me to the current situation in some ways in Israel, and the fact that warfare, can also make us cruel. Now, sometimes that cruelty is absolutely necessary. You really can't fight if you're too sympathetic. You have to kind of tamp down those feelings. Nonetheless, you have to struggle to maintain your sympathy and humanity in the midst of doing that. And that is a real challenge. And it's certainly the challenge that Israel and its armies are facing right now. And in some ways, you see it in these two explanations, particularly the second one. So I wanted to mention that. One more thing. Well, you know what? Yeah. And then I'm going to pick up on a different theme when we meet next time also about this. There's a remarkable statement that says, what does this say? If you do this, you won't live for a long time. There's one other place in which the Torah says that. It's also about parents and children. And it says you should honor your father and your mother that you live a long time. And so there is a commentary which says this teaches us something else, and that is that you have to be as careful about something which is a minor mitzvah, easy to do, and something which is much more, in some ways, important and harder to do. They call it a mitzvah kala, simple mitzvah, and a mitzvah chamura, a sort of heavy, important mitzvah. And the fact that the same reward is given for both suggests that this comment says that we have to be as careful about a simple mitzvah as a heavy one. And I think that's an interesting insight, and it's worth remembering. I'm going to say one more thing about this next time, which will get really to a deep philosophical question, which is the question of the suffering of the innocent and the guilty. We're going to get there from looking at this passage about shooing away the mother's bird. So we have just a few minutes left. Questions or comments, anybody? Okay. Sandy, you're sort of half.
No, yeah, I wanted to wait. So
Go ahead. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's very nice that you chase the mother bird away, but the end result is you take her young. So, yeah. What I'm saying is it's still cruel because you take her young.
Yeah. And I want to say again, and we've talked about this many times, Jewish tradition does not require us to be vegetarians, period. Right? Now, you can say it's being a vegetarian is on a higher level. We shouldn't sustain ourselves from animal flesh. You can say that, but that's not what the Jewish tradition is. It's quite,
Right.
You could say the Jewish tradition would prefer eating less flesh. I think that's a fair interpretation. And being very aware also, as part of the laws of kashrut, are to teach us to be aware that an animal has sacrificed its life so that we can eat, and have some reverence for that act, and having value and understanding the price of the food that we eat. I think that the Jewish tradition really emphasizes, but it doesn't require vegetarians. Mati, Natty, do you have your hand up? I can't. You're also you're muted. Maddie, you're muted, so I can't hear what you're saying.
No, I did not raise my hand. I'm just enjoying your class.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Anybody at all? Okay, so I want to remind you of something that I said last week, and that is that on Tuesday of next week, I'm scheduled for jury duty. But I don't want to cancel the class if I don't have to. So Monday night, I'm supposed, you know how this works. I'm supposed to call in and see if I'm on the list or I'm not on the list yet. So I will do that. And then I will send you an email either way to say, no, we won't have class. I'm on jury duty, or yes, we will. And that'll go out Monday night. So look for that. And hopefully, I'd much prefer to see you on Tuesday than to sit on the jury, but that, I also acknowledge that it's an important civic responsibility, and if called off, I fully intend to serve. On that note, I want to thank you for joining me, and I'm hoping to see you all next week. Have a good
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.